Great. Well, thank you again for coming. And I'll just say that I do have some props up here if you haven't had a chance before the show to come up and have a look. More volume. There we go. More props. Oh, yeah, okay. That's across the street, actually. You'll have. I do have a variety of fossils up here, some including like a real dinosaur bone from the North Slope. If you want to have a look at that, you can pick it up and look at it, and a few other things that might make a little more sense after we get into the talk a bit. But by means of introduction, I just sort of like to say that Alaska is a pretty diverse state in terms of its fossils. And my job as the Earth Science Curator and paleontologist is to wander around the wilds of the state looking for all sorts of interesting things. And in particular, I've literally worked in all corners of the state, from down in southeast, down to the southwest parts of the state, into the interior regions, and of course the North Slope. And I'm going to talk about a couple of the sites, two sites in particular in Alaska that are especially relevant to unraveling the dinosaur story, because there are a lot more cool fossils in Alaska than just dinosaurs, but I am going to focus on dinosaurs. And to sort of simplify that previous map, here are the major sites for Alaskan dinosaurs in a nutshell. And I might point out that, again, they're widely distributed across the state. And some of the better known sites include the Talkeetna Mountains. A couple of years ago, we discovered a huge new area for tracks along the lower Yukon River, which is pretty amazing, but we'll talk about that another day and another time. I wanted to focus tonight on two sites in particular, and the first being the North Slope. And this is really where a lot of the really cool action is. If you want to find dinosaur bones and dinosaur teeth, then you want to head to the North Slope, because that's the place where almost all of the bones and teeth in Alaska come from. Not totally, but mostly. And what I want to also talk about is the site that we'll see is actually very complementary in terms of information to the North Slope, and that's Denali National Park and Preserve, which is practically our backyard. And you may or may not know it, but Denali National Park is an incredible treasure trove of dinosaur tracks. It was actually quite remarkable, in fact, that we didn't realize for quite a while, until 2005, that there are amazing dinosaurs in Denali. What's important about those two sites in particular is that they represent dinosaurs that lived during one of the three major periods of Earth history that we call the Age of Dinosaurs, which we call that the Mesozoic. And there are the three big periods of the Mesozoic era, which you may know about: the Triassic, the Jurassic, of course, everyone knows the best, thanks to some movie or another, and then the Cretaceous. And the Cretaceous period is kind of funny. It's not shown on here. This time scale that you see, that's done by artist Ray Troll. He has a new one out, by the way. It's down at the Anchorage Museum. It'll be in the new book. We can talk about that later. This time scale represents the last 550 million years of Earth history. And it represents all these different names that you see here are actually the subdivisions of geologic time based first and foremost on their fossil content. That's the basis for the geologic time scale. The Cretaceous period, although it's just a short little sliver here, actually represents 80 million years of Earth history. There has been more time has elapsed since the end of the Cretaceous period, which was when all the dinosaurs died, till today. More time that has elapsed since during the Cretaceous period than since the end of the Cretaceous till today. That's a lot of time. So this is 66 million years ago is the most recent number for the date, give or take a few hours, of when the dinosaurs went extinct. And it happens to be that the rocks in Alaska, where we find dinosaurs up on the Colville River on the North Slope, and in Denali National Park right here in Alaska, in the interior, they actually both happen to be rocks laid down about within really 4 million years of the very end of the Age of Dinosaurs, about 70 million years ago. Actually, technically, it's like 69.2, but we won't dice hairs on that one. We'll call it 70. And so the dinosaurs I'm going to talk about today, in other words, from two different points in the state, are dinosaurs that lived they're probably the same species because they lived at approximately the same geologic time. That is actually a really cool thing. So let's harken back now to the Cretaceous period about 70 million years ago, and believe it or not, this is our continent, North America, a very different looking place at that time. And I think you can see here, this is all the blue, of course, is ocean. Here is the North American continent, and running right up the middle, or nearly up the middle of the continent, was a shallow seaway called the Western Interior Seaway. Now that seaway was teeming with marine reptiles, like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, which I'm not going to talk about tonight. And then way up here at the northern end of that seaway, so it emptied out into into the Arctic Ocean basin. The Arctic Ocean basin at this time actually was ice-free. Pretty interesting. And because of that, actually, it had some important ramifications for the climate of Alaska. And in fact, way up here at the north end of this western portion of North America was, of course, Alaska, where these dinosaurs were running around. So there's Alaska way up there. What's pretty interesting is you are probably familiar with plate tectonics. It's the whole idea that continents move. We know that in Alaska because we get some rock and roll and earthquakes thanks to plate tectonics. And that process has been going on for a very, very long time in Earth's history. And what's really interesting is that 70 million years ago, Alaska, thanks to plate tectonics, was farther north than it is today. So that's pretty crazy when you think about, here is my very approximate line representing the Arctic Circle, which you notice on this map would have actually been south of Alaska, period. Today it runs through basically about the northern third of Alaska. So in other words, Alaska was closer to the North Pole. How close? Well, it's a little hard to be real precise about that, but the best estimates place northern Alaska somewhere around 80 degrees north latitude. And for reference, today that same real estate is at about 70 degrees north latitude. So in other words, approximately 10 degrees farther north than today. And that's a lot. So, and some estimates even put that higher than that, believe it or not. So Alaska was farther north. And that being said, we still had this amazing pile of dinosaurs running around. This is an image of, I'll actually show this image a few times. This image, by the way, was done by artist James Havens in Anchorage. And he did a spectacular job, and you may have seen the original of this at the Museum of the North across the street. It's the backdrop for some mounted dinosaur skeletons. And what I wanted to point out here actually is that this depicts the scene on northern Alaska 70 million years ago. And I'll talk about the dinosaurs in a minute, but actually take a look at the plants. The plants actually are really important. These are very accurately depicted. The understory of that area was ferns, and then this is the crazy part, trees. What are trees doing in northern Alaska today, much less when Alaska was 10 degrees farther north? That's crazy. In other words, we had, during the age of dinosaurs in Alaska, polar forests. This doesn't exist on planet Earth today. It was a very different world. And these trees, in fact, mostly were conifers. They're probably, in many cases, closely related to something called metasequoia. Well, actually, some of them are metasequoia, which is called the dawn redwood, which is still a living species today. There's a lot of horsetails and ferns in the understory. There were some broadleaf plants as well. And what's really cool is this forest, that these dinosaurs were living in a forest in northern Alaska. And you can pretty much envision Denali National Park as having a very similar kind of a forested environment at the same time as well. The reason we like fossil plants is because fossil plants also provide a really important piece of information that we need to know to understand dinosaurs, and that is how warm was the climate? Was it a cold winter, a warm winter? Was the overall climate, very moderate? Was it actually very much like today? Well, the plants give you the answer. Of course, part of the answer is just saying, we know that there were forests in the Arctic. That says a lot. But how much warmer was it then? And what you can actually do is use fossil leaves of broadleaf trees as basically paleothermometers. And what's neat about this is today, if you go around the world and you look at leaves of trees at high latitudes, like Fairbanks, and go out your door and you look at the leaves of those trees, almost all of them have leaf margins that are shaped like little teeth. They're rounded or they're toothed, in other words. If you go to the tropics, most of the leaves are smooth, or entire margined, it's called. And the ratio in any given forest of toothed, or the proportion, I should say, of any forest of toothed leaves to smooth leaves gives you an approximation of the actual climate, the temperature of that forest. And so warmer climates, more smooth leaves, colder climates, more toothed leaves. And without getting into, this is the only graph tonight, okay? This kind of study shows that we can actually put a temperature, an approximation of the temperature of a fossil forest, if you will, based on the percentage of a whole bunch of different leaves that you look at and count and document. And this was done really well by a UAF scientist named Susie Tomczyk as part of her PhD work here at UAF. And she actually came up with the number that the average annual climate in Denali, in this case, and it's very similar for the North Slope, 70 million years ago was about 7 degrees centigrade or 42 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about the same as Juneau, Alaska. That's how warm it was in the way northern reaches of Alaska 70 million years ago. That's pretty crazy. That also gives you some indication of the capacity for climate change that this Earth is possible to experience. Okay, so I mentioned we've got the North Slope, we've got Denali. The important thing to remember here in these two sites, being the premier sites of Alaskan fossils, is that they have two very different types of data, two very different types of fossils. The first, again, being North Slope, that's a story that is primarily bones and teeth, and we love that. There are tracks up there as well. But when you go to Denali National Park, the story is almost entirely tracks, no bones, no teeth, with a few rare exceptions, but almost entirely tracks. And at first glance, you might say, well, that's kind of frustrating. How do you compare those two? But for me, actually, it says, wow, this is a great opportunity, because the way I look at it, what you can do is you can use the information based on bones and teeth from the North Slope to tell us about who was making the tracks in Denali National Park. So it actually helps. That's something that's very difficult to do. A given footprint, you can't say that was made by this dinosaur or that, unless you have maybe that same species living and found in the same rocks. But that's not the case in Denali. But we can turn to the North Slope to help us inform us who were making the tracks in Denali. And likewise, we might find tracks because, think about it, an animal in its lifetime, it leaves millions and millions of footprints, but that one animal only leaves a small pile of bones when it dies, right? So tracks are really important because we have a lot of them. So looking at a lot of tracks and a lot of different tracks tells us about the kinds of things we should be looking for in northern Alaska. So these two, by sheer dumb luck, we've got these two sites in Alaska from the same age that have really wonderful complementary data. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is I'm going to highlight some of the things that we see on the North Slope and then mention what that tells us about the tracks in Denali and sometimes vice versa. Okay. This is the Colville River, the biggest drainage in northern Alaska. Drains a very large part of the north side of the Brooks Range. And you can see it's a pretty wide river. And if you look closely, there's a camp. One of our camps is right there. And there's a boat right there. That's how we get around on the North Slope. We fly in, land on a gravel bar, put together a couple of boats, and then we float down the river. And it's great on a day like this. And probably many of you have been onto the North Slope, and you know it's not always quite that nice, especially in August. But this is where we look for the dinosaur bones. It's in those bluffs, those rocks. They're something we call the Prince Creek Formation, and it's sticking out of those rocks are bones and teeth that we want to find. And for many years, the premier site for dinosaurs in northern Alaska is this one layer of rock that my colleague Greg Erickson is kneeling in front of here, and this is called the Liscombe bone bed. And the Liscombe bone bed is pretty exceptional. It's a layer of rock. It's only about, well, it varies in thickness, but anywhere from maybe 10 to as much as 30 inches in thickness. It's a layer of rock that extends many, many feet across the outcrop, and you dig into that layer of rock, you find thousands and thousands of dinosaur bones, primarily of one species. And this is, you can see these are the bones right here in the process of being excavated. And if you look closely, there's a bone right there. There's another part of a bone there. There's another bone there. Actually, there's one right there. This is literally just like, imagine taking a bunch of dinosaurs and throwing them in a blender and then spewing it onto the landscape and burying it. That's what the Liscombe bone bed is. It's pretty remarkable. We have been excavating at this site for many years. We now have something like 6,000 individual bones that we've excavated out of that layer. And that's, by the way, where this bone came from right here. And so, 6,000 bones. We don't mind passing a few around. In fact, here, let's just pass around a bone here. We can, once you start and just sort of pass it around. There you go. And the type of dinosaur that is in that bone bed is something called a duck-billed dinosaur. And duck-billed dinosaurs are very common types of dinosaurs from the Cretaceous period. They're probably the most abundant, common kind of dinosaur on the planet during the Cretaceous period. We call them the cows of the Cretaceous because they were plant eaters and they were really abundant and they lived in herds. The question for a long time has been, are the dinosaurs in the Liscombe bone bed the same species as some species we know from down in like Montana and Alberta, where I worked many years ago, or are they a unique species to Alaska? And that's been a big question. So, well, how do you answer a question like that? In a word, comparison. I had a PhD student who worked on this question and spent a lot of time traveling to museums all over North America and looking at all of the similar types of duck-billed dinosaurs. And after looking at all this material and comparing and describing every bone in gory detail, came up with the conclusion that, this thing is different. This is a different species than anywhere else. And so that means we get to give it a name. Because if we're going to name a new species of dinosaur, we have to write a paper and get it published. And then we have to suggest a new name for this dinosaur. Well, we did that, and we wanted to use a name that was honoring the native people of that area, the Nupiaq people. So I talked to Ron Brower about a name that would work well for this dinosaur. And after a bunch of discussions, we came up with what seems like a tongue twister. It's not so bad. It's called Agrunelik cookpicensis. And it's not that, it looks worse than it is. There's a lot of vowels and it's fun, but so Agrunelik roughly translates to ancient chewer, because this is a kind of dinosaur that chewed vegetation. It didn't just bite and swallow, it actually chewed food. That's very weird for a reptile to do that. Cookpic is the native name for the Colville River. So ensis is of this. So this is the ancient chewer of the Colville River. So that's the name. And this is one of the, right now, 4 named dinosaurs from Alaska. And this is a dinosaur species only found in Alaska. And this is a skull of a juvenile right here. And we have 3 mounted skeletons at the museum, where you can see one of them right there. So if you haven't seen those at the museum, please come and have a gander. So here it is in all its glory, adults and juveniles of Agrunelik. And this is kind of cool. So we've got this duck-billed dinosaur, and you notice on its head here, it's kind of just kind of flat on the head. What's interesting is we found evidence for another kind of duck-billed dinosaur. We haven't named it and we haven't published it quite yet, but this is a kind of duck-billed dinosaur that's got a crazy crest on its head. This group of dinosaurs are called lambeosaurs, and we have rather cool. We have this partial skull of a lambeosaur from Alaska, which is really crazy because basically we have two kinds of duck-billed dinosaurs, and it's a really ugly skull though. It doesn't look pretty. It's tough to study, but it does have teeth, and it's got a bunch of other distinctive features, and everything we've seen so far suggests it's also a distinct species. But come back maybe next year and I'll have a name for you. So now let's look at Denali. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I had a question about if it was eating vegetation. Does it have the molars?
So our question is, if it's eating vegetation, does it have molars? And grinding teeth. And the answer is it didn't have molars like a mammal, but what it had instead is a very crazy thing called a dental battery, which is essentially a whole bunch of small teeth that operate together to form one giant grinding surface. So effectively, the upper jaw was one grinding surface, and the lower jaw was another, pretty similar to really what a moose does. And they would grind, when they chewed, their jaws actually flexed out slightly, and it accommodated a grinding chewing motion. So it's a really cool story. Chewing in hadrosaurs is an amazing, and duck-billed dinosaurs is an amazing subject. And if you want to come up later, I'll give you some more gory details on the skull here. Thank you for that question. So let's turn our attention now for hadrosaurs in Denali. What do we find there? Do we have hadrosaur tracks? And the answer is, oh yeah. We got a lot of hadrosaur tracks in Denali. And this is how we look for them, by the way. This is the rigors of field work. Basically, you go out and you hike, and you look at the rocks. And you have to learn how to identify dinosaur footprints. So here's a good test for you. Do you see the dinosaur footprints? Ponder that for a minute. So this is Denny Capps. He's the geologist at Denali National Park, and he's pondering some dinosaur tracks right there. And I'll give you a little hint. So what he's looking at there is a layer of rocks that are not any longer laying horizontally. They're actually tipped up a bit on angle. And one of them is a big bed of very coarse sandstone. And what his hand is on there is the bottom of the bed of sandstone that's been tipped up. So it's kind of like looking almost up underneath from the ground at the bottom of this layer. And I'm going to give you a hint. Okay, watch this. Whoop. Hey, whoa, whoa. Did you see that? Actually, that whole surface is dinosaur tracks, the whole bottom side. Some of them are really nice three-toed tracks. Some of them are all churned up, and it's heels and toes, and it's a big mess. In fact, this has been called the dinosaur dance floor. And as it turns out, it's just a tiny little layer that it pales in comparison. The amount of tracks in Denali Park are just phenomenal. This is just, another one of these layers. It's a cool spot, but we have so much more amazing stuff in the park. And those tracks are three-toed, they're short toes, then they're broad toes. That's a classic duck-billed dinosaur footprint. And probably the reason why you might not have recognized that as a footprint at all is because it's doing something footprints shouldn't do. It's coming out of the rock. Footprints are supposed to go into the rock, right? Well, yes, that happens, definitely. But here's actually at least two ways you can make a dinosaur track. First, you can imagine sort of the typical way like we would make walking across a mud surface. You stick your foot in the ground and you leave a hole. Voila, you have a track. But what happens if that track fills with sediment. You just made another track. And that track, if it weathers out because it's a different kind of sediment like sand, is what we call the natural cast. It's the infilling of what we call the true track. And I have some examples up here. Here is a natural cast, and you can come up and look at these later. It's a relatively small one. And you can see it's a nice little footprint sticking out of the rock. And when I put this flexible sill putty stuff on it, which is how we make copies in the field, you basically make what's sort of like the original track, the true track. These natural casts are one of the very common ways we find tracks in Denali. And that's not in a lot of people's search image, which is probably why it took until 2005 to recognize that there were tracks in Denali. But these are some fairly classic three-toed duck-billed dinosaur footprints. Most dinosaurs, not all, are three-toed. And duck-billed dinosaurs have these very sort of fat toes, and they're relatively short and squat. And if you look at this slab of rock right here, there's another one right there. We look for these sometimes in landslides where rocks have just basically crumbled out of the mountainside and the rocks are all turned up, but they expose the bottom layers of rocks really nicely. Okay, another dinosaur we have now back to the North Slope is a horned dinosaur. So a lot of people are familiar with Triceratops, the classic kind of iconic three-horned, big, four-legged plant-eating dinosaur. We don't have those in Alaska, but we do have a relative that is called Pachyrhinosaurus. And Pachyrhinosaurus literally means thick-nosed reptile. And instead of having big horns on its head, it has some horns. Instead of having 3 big horns, it actually has these big, gnarly bosses of bone. And that's where it gets its name. And we have a distinct species here in Alaska. And this, by the way, Ray Troll, who did this exhibit in the Anchorage Museum, which is still going on, he always wanted to do this. He made a Pachyrhinosaur model, actually a colleague of his did, bashing through the wall there of the Anchorage Museum, which is very clever. This is actually some real bone here. So we have this really interesting, again, plant-eating, four-legged dinosaur, and it has a very different kind of a footprint. And in Denali National Park, in fact, we find a lot of horned dinosaur footprints. And so here is my colleague Kevin May from the museum. Here he is holding up a cast, a natural cast of, in this case, a four-toed, probably, well, I can't say for sure it's Pachyrhinosaurus, but if I had to put my money on it, I'd say it's very likely Pachyrhinosaurus footprint. Anybody recognize this stuff right there? Right there? Yeah, I heard skin or scales, exactly. These are actually impressions of what I believe to be our Pachyrhinosaur or ceratopsian horned dinosaur skin impressions. And they're very large. They're like the size of almost like dime to quarter size. And they're very different, as it turns out, from duck-billed dinosaur skin impressions, which we have also found, that are much smaller and they're only, I don't know, like pea-sized scales. And these are much larger. So found that last summer, and that was like, oh, that's pretty cool. Yeah. What about the meat-eating dinosaurs? And I'll just say that I don't have time to get into the detail of all the species that we find on the North Slope, but there are about 13, 14 species we recognize. So I'm going to kind of hit the big ones here. But of course, when I speak of big ones, this is our dominant predator in Alaska 70 million years ago. It's a tyrannosaur, but it's not Tyrannosaurus rex, which I, by the way, have some, I have a tooth up here of a Tyrannosaurus rex and a claw of Tyrannosaurus rex. You can come up and look at those. We have instead a relatively smaller relative that's been named Nanuqsaurus hoaglandii. And this is a pretty impressive beast. It was top dog in the ecosystem for sure, and the dominant, probably the dominant predator 70 million years ago in Alaska. Do we find footprints of these guys in Denali? Well, I don't have a picture here to show you. I will tell you that last summer and I didn't get a picture of it. We did find a site where I'm pretty sure we have a Tyrannosaur-sized footprint that could very well have been made by Nanoxaurus. But I will show you some other very cool meat-eating dinosaur footprints from Denali. This is a really beautiful one. Again, a natural cast. 3 really beautiful toes. Notice the toes are relatively long and narrow. And actually right there at the very end of each toe is a claw impression, kind of a triangular little mark that represents the very end of the claw of the toe. And so again, there's a claw of a Tyrannosaurus rex. As you can see, they leave very distinct little triangular impressions. Some of these could be made by young Tyrannosaurs. It's very difficult to look at a footprint like this, a 3-toed meat-eating dinosaur footprint, and say that's a this or that's a that. It's really difficult to do. But one of the options could be small Tyrannosaurs. Another option are a group of toothless dinosaurs called ornithomimosaurs. And ornithomimosaurs look like, well, they call them ostrich mimics. And that's what ornithomimosaur means, literally, is a bird mimic dinosaur, because they do look very bird-like, ostrich-like. And we do have some bones from that group on the north slope, and we have some tracks. Here are true tracks, and here's a natural cast of some beautiful tracks that I think very likely could be from this group of dinosaurs.
Are those tracks the hind legs or the front?
Yeah, the good question. These are tracks from the hind foot. Yep. So these are all the 3-toed impressions from the hind feet.
Was the front foot 3-toed?
The front, you should ask about the front feet, the front hand, the hands, if you will. So all meat-eating dinosaurs only walked on their hind limbs. They never walked on their front limbs, with maybe one weird possible exception. And Spinosaurus, very good. And they had variable numbers of fingers on their front hand, on their hands, basically. Most of them were 3-fingered. Tyrannosaurus rex was 2-fingered. There's even one called Mononychus that was 1-fingered. So they do weird things. Yeah. Yes, and like these are basically grasping hands. In fact, they didn't have a true thumb, but they had something equivalent to like a thumb, a prehensile thumb. They could very literally grab things. Yeah. So turning back to the North Slope again, you know, when you start looking at meat-eating dinosaurs, you're talking about the dinosaurs that are going to be the rarest and hardest to find, because like any predators in today's environments, they're the rarest, right? You have lots of plant eaters, and then you have a much, much, much smaller population of the things that eat them. So you find a lot more moose in Alaska than you find bears and wolves. Same thing is true for dinosaurs. In northern Alaska, we find teeth of a couple of 2 different types of small carnivorous dinosaurs that belong to a group that are called Deinonychosaurs, which is a great mouthful. Deinonychosaurs include this one group we call Dromaeosaurs, another called Troodontids. Don't worry about the names, but we do find rare bones and rare teeth. We know the groups are there. We haven't quite found enough to name a species, but we know that they're there. And here's 2 depictions. So this is Troodon, and this is basically Velociraptor. So Velociraptor made famous by the Jurassic Park movies. The sad news is Velociraptor in Jurassic Park actually in real life had a skull about that big, and was actually only would have come up to about your knees in height. So not nearly as big as Spielberg at least initially made them out to be, but they're still really cool animals. And Alaska has its own kind of Velociraptor, but bear in mind, you know, they're much smaller than everyone likes to make them out to be. One of the crazy things about this group of dinosaurs, and the thing that makes them recognizable, is that on their hind feet, instead of having, they have 3 big toes that they walk, that, you know, on their hind feet, but instead of walking on all 3 toes, they actually only walk on 2 toes. And the other toe like this foot here from Deinonychus from Montana, that toe has, it sports this very scary slasher claw. And this is how they dispatched prey, is they basically, and we have evidence that these were probably pack hunters like wolves, that they actually used this very scary slashing claw on their second toe, which would be equivalent to your, like your second, right next to your big toe there. They had this huge slasher claw. Well, when I started working in Denali, I thought, nobody's really talked much about those kinds of dinosaurs in Denali. And I said, we should be looking for two-toed tracks in Denali. And sure enough, literally like the second day out, we started to find them. And if you have a look at this picture, this is what I would call a really good example of a two-toed track. And if you're looking at that going, yeah, right, here's here's the same image with a little bit more of an interpretation on it. And if that's still a little hard, this is a replica of that actual footprint right here. And you can come up and look at it. And someone, to their credit, earlier tonight said, hey, is that a two-toed track? So, yeah. And this is the copy I made of that original footprint in this stuff called silt putty that we make copies with. So come up and have a look at that later. And to sort of help you interpret what you're seeing there, basically this is what would be the middle digit. And this second, so it's kind of like a peace dinosaur, right? It's like, hey, peace man, woohoo. And so that's digit 3, that's digit 4. And the second digit doesn't leave an impression in the ground. It's held up off the ground. And sometimes, though, you can see the base of that toe, an impression from just the very base of the toe right about there. It's not always present, though. That's pretty cool. We have a lot of these actually in the park. And we even have like beautiful impressions of the claw, which is way the heck out there at the end of the toe. Really interesting. And we have a site where it's dominated by meat-eating dinosaur tracks for some strange reason. I don't know why. I have no clue, but it's really cool. The neat thing about this, and I'll just answer your question in just a sec, the neat thing about this is that based on the size and the shape of the footprints, not only can we say it's from a Deinonychosaur, but we can say it's from probably one of the two types, namely the one we call Troodon. And that's really neat because no one anywhere in the world has ever identified for sure Troodon footprints before. But I think we can do it here because we know that they lived in northern Alaska for sure. And what was your question?
The question is are they handling their prey with the two little...
Oh, are they handling their prey with their hands? Certainly. Well, both. They would have grabbed onto prey, and they could have lifted their foot up and just whoosh, whoosh, and slashed a dinosaur with that claw.
All four are...
They could use all four.
Not just for moving, but to eat.
For dispatching their prey, yeah. They're weapons.
Did they catch them?
Well, they would have to chase after them. These are very fast-running dinosaurs. That's what dromaeosaur means, running dinosaur. And that's because they could run after their prey, and then they would basically, as a group, probably like a group predators, would attack something larger than themselves and bring it down.
So would they attack with the
With both, yeah, with the hands and the feet. Kind of scary, I know. So I think you're getting a picture here that what we have is actually a really neat site, both the North Slope and Denali, really interesting sites. And the story is really, it's still very much unfolding. I've got 2 weeks of field work planned in Denali this summer. I've got 3 weeks of time planned on the North Slope. And we have a lot of exciting things happening. And just sort of to finish up, I'm going to mention that we have a site, one new site right now on the North Slope we call Jacob's Bed, which is a really amazing site because it's producing a whole bunch of new dinosaurs we've never seen before. And they are mostly coming out in the form of very small little fossils. But they're types of teeth and bones of dinosaurs we've never seen before in Alaska. So I'm going to leave it at that. There's more to be said there. This is the way that we actually find some of them, was we dig out this little thin layer of rock. It's like a miniature bone bed this time. and then we dump it into a screen, more like archaeological work actually, and we spray it with water, and we sit there and we pick through the sediment. And I'll tell you, if you want cold, miserable work, stand next to the Colville River when it's like 34 degrees and raining, and do that for 12 hours a day. Question in the back.
Why is it called Jacob's bed?
Jacob van Veldhuizen, who was a volunteer and employee of mine at the museum, and that name should be recognizable here in Fairbanks. He's a Fairbanksan, and he was the one who actually originally found this bed back in 2012, I think it was. Yeah. So you find a cool site, find a cool dinosaur, we'll name it after you. And I might point out that sometimes, going beyond dinosaurs, we find all sorts of crazy things, and actually we find fossil mammals up there on the North Slope. You know what we find? We find teeth. But we find teeth that, yes, that is a tooth at the end of my finger, right there. And that's how you find fossil mammals, is you have to screen many, many tons of sediment to find these tiny, tiny little teeth. And if you get lucky, we actually find complete lower jaws. We're finding amazing stuff. And this represents a new species of mammal. And we're actually, I do know what the name of this is, but I can't tell you yet because the paper is, we're about to resubmit the paper for final acceptance, we hope, in the journal. But this is a new and unique species of mammal to Alaska, which is pretty cool. And yeah, it was the size of a little mouse, but it's actually a marsupial. It's in the same group as things like kangaroos and opossums. And actually, we have like 4 new types of mammals up there that we're describing the teeth of right now.
Is that from that shaker box that you had?
Yeah, it's from those little shaker boxes. That's where it starts anyway. Sometimes these discoveries, by the way, don't happen in the field. We bring back piles and piles of sediment and we pick it under a microscope in the lab. And then one day I walk in the lab and one of my students or volunteers says, "Oh, I found something weird. What is this?" And I go, "Holy fuck." And then I'm not a specialist in these, so I send them off to my colleague, Jalen Aberle, who is at the University of Colorado Boulder, and she looks at them and says, "Holy cow, geez, what?" And then we say, that's pretty cool. Yeah, there's a close-up of that tooth. Boy, it's, eye squinty. Hey, there's fish too. We got crazy fossil fish up there we're figuring out right now. We've got paddlefish, we've got sturgeon, crazy kinds of pike, things related to salmon. We're finding bones, teeth, jaws of those sorts of fish up there as well. We're trying to not just figure out the dinosaurs, we want to figure out their whole ecosystem. What world did they live in? What was swimming in the streams? What kind of mammals were there? What kind of plants were growing there? And then it's all one big story, and you don't want to be exclusive. And we're finding back now in Denali that there's even a few bones there. Not much, frankly. It's some, but there's not much. We're excited to find them. Park was really excited that we found them. But they're little bones from things like duck-billed dinosaurs. Surprise, surprise. If I were to guess what I'd find, I'd find a duck-billed dinosaur, and that's what we found. This is a thin section of the bone. The orange part actually or the pinkish part is actually the bone shown under special polarized light. And for this summer, we'll be working here. This is a site that we call the Colosseum. This is kind of cool. So you notice these are big cliffs, and see all the little bumpy bumps on the cliff there? What you're looking at are layers of rock that have been vertically tipped up, almost on end. And every one of those little depressions is a footprint. There's gazillions of footprints. By the way, it turns out this is the smaller of 2 sites. We found another site last summer that's even bigger than this. That's the kind of discoveries waiting to be made in Alaska. So we're actually going to be flying drones over this site to map it this summer with AQUASI, which is the group here at UAF that does a lot of, sorry, I shouldn't say drones, unmanned aerial systems. And they're going to be flying these over the site, making a really cool 3-dimensional map of this site. So, bottom line, come and visit us at the museum. We have the largest collection of polar dinosaurs in the world at our museum. It's growing. We're finding new stuff, and hopefully by this time next year I can tell you something else interesting that we found. So thanks for coming, and I'm happy to entertain some questions. Yes, in the back.
I'm curious, how do you go about your research? Do you just try and find things and then ask questions about them, or do you go into your research with questions that you're seeking to answer?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. How do we go about our science like that? What we do is we start out knowing that, oh, there's a site that's got dinosaurs, for example, like on the North Slope. And yeah, we could just go up there and say, hey, our goal is to go dig stuff up. And then when we find something, we'll say, oh, let's make a story about that. The way we've approached this site is we look at North Slope of Alaska and its polar dinosaurs, the best place in the world to find polar dinosaurs, and we say, what are the questions that it can answer that nothing else, no other site on the planet can give us information on? That's the way we approach working up on the North Slope in Denali. And so we actually, our work up on the North Slope is funded by National Science Foundation, and so we have some very clearly stated hypotheses about what we're looking for and trying to understand in northern Alaska. And just to briefly touch on those, I mean, again, partly it's who is there, because that's a fundamental question. And once we know who's there, we can ask, are they the same species found at lower latitudes? If they are, or if they're not, what does that say about the biogeography of dinosaurs up and down North America, which has been a lot of papers written about that. So we can actually test that kind of hypothesis. We also, especially the work I do with my colleague Greg Erickson, he takes bones and he slices them up. So that's actually this dinosaur bone here you noticed was kind of, had a flat end. We take bones and we slice them up. And after we slice them up, we polish them down, make thin sections, look at them under a microscope, and then you can do really cool things like say, okay, can we answer the question, how old is this dinosaur? And I don't mean like how many millions of years. I mean, is this animal 2 years old, 3 years old? And we can do that by looking at a whole variety of different individuals. And we figured out how to age duck-billed dinosaurs from northern Alaska. And the cool thing about that is, if you know how old a dinosaur is, and from the bones you know how big it is, and you have that for a variety of animals from small to adult size, you can make a growth curve to talk about how fast that animal grew. And from that you can infer physiology, things like warm-blooded. So then it gets to the big question, are dinosaurs that lived in northern Alaska, were they warm-blooded? And how does that tie to the big question, are dinosaurs, period, warm-blooded? And we're actually, we were able to make a growth curve for this new duck-billed dinosaur, and it has the same exact growth trajectory as animals, its closest relatives living at low latitudes in much warmer environments. What we're inferring is that this is great evidence for dinosaur warm-bloodedness from that. Long answer to your question, but yes, absolutely. We go into it with a hypothesis-driven sort of approach. Yeah?
Are the gravel pits, say, up along the Hall Road, things that have been mined out to make the road, are those sites for fossils or not so much?
She's asking if the gravel pits up on the Hall Road up heading north are sources for dinosaurs, and the answer is basically no. Yeah, the places, you have to, most of those gravel pits are very young, unconsolidated sediments. And they might have the occasional mammoth or steppe bison or something like that in there from the Ice Age, but no, they don't really have any dinosaur bones. Yeah. Yes?
How big was the Tyrannosaur that was found?
Oh, so how big is the Tyrannosaur that was found in Alaska? Nanuqsaurus. I would say that if I were to put my hand on tops of its hip, so a hip height is a good way we talk about dinosaur. Yep, somewhere in there. Quite big, and we're trying to get a better idea of that. We have some bones that suggest it's probably a little bit bigger than it was originally believed to be. And then the other neat thing you can do, this is cool, if you find a footprint of something you say that looks like a tyrannosaur, you can measure, like so here, this is definitely not a tyrannosaur footprint, but you've got 3 toes. You can measure the length of that middle toe, and then you can multiply basically by 4. And it varies usually a little bit more than that. it gives you an estimate of the hip height of that animal. So tracks might actually provide some information on how big our Alaskan Tyrannosaur was. So we're looking for ever bigger tracks to see what the record is, and we don't have a lot of them. Yeah, in the back there.
It's no secret. What inspired you to start digging around the Colville River area?
Well, yeah, great. How did the Colville River basically get discovered? It's a great story, and essentially it was by accident, like many important sites. Back in the 1960s, a geologist, a guy named Robert Liscombe, was out actually on assignment, working that stretch of the bluff, mapping the rocks. And he found some bones, which at the time, this was in the early 1960s, he thought, crazy, they had some like mammal bones up here. I wonder what those are. And he threw them into a collecting bag and took them back to corporate headquarters, where they stayed for a long time until eventually they were re-examined, and one of the geologists said, I don't think these are mammal bones. And they were eventually given to a couple of different paleontologists who recognized them as dinosaur. And the long story short there was that Berkeley got involved with our museum, and they came up to the Colville to look for this site and found them. And the reason you can find it pretty easily is because there's so many bloody bones in the Liscombe bone bed, they're just spewing out of the hillside. Relocated the site, and that began many years of work, not just in the Liscombe bone bed, in that area in general. And these are the northernmost dinosaurs in the world. Yeah.
It's fairly common to hear about paleo latitude, how close we were to the pole. Do any geologists help with reconstructing paleo altitude as a climatic effect, or?
That's a good question, and Dave's been up there. He knows this area very well. So I talked to a guy from USGS, Geological Survey, who was working on reconstructing the paleo altitude of the Brooks Range. Because I was asking him, I said, I've got an artist who wants to paint the Brooks Range in the backdrop of my dinosaur painting. How big do I tell him to make them? And I don't know. And so this geologist started speaking in Greek or some language that I'm in the geology department. I didn't know what he was talking about, but it sounded really good. And the bottom line is he said, pretty much, very likely, the Brooks Range, at least at the time, which was actively growing when those dinosaurs were there, were probably emergent, and they were probably pretty conspicuous on the landscape, and very likely were high enough to support snow. So yeah, I think they were serious mountains, roughly comparable to today, possibly a little lower. That's the best I got. But we do know also that the area very close, the area where like the Liscombe bone bed is, which was very close to the sea, the margin of the sea, of course, was at, very much at sea level. So yeah. Yeah, over there.
You mentioned that you discovered a lot of tracks, and there's a debate about how these dinosaurs survived in cold weather. Have you found any evidence of whether or not they were possibly migratory and moved south towards warmer climates?
Yeah, migration is a great question, and that's actually one of the other hypotheses that we're looking at in testing. Because actually that bone, cutting up bones and looking at them, we can compare those to lower latitude animals, and we can actually come up with some ideas regarding migration from what we call the bone histology. The idea was possibly to escape they may not have been cold, but they were certainly long, dark winters, that these animals may have migrated to lower latitudes to escape the harsh conditions. But a couple of things go against that. One of the big ones is that for them to get from 80 degrees north latitude down to some place where it was even like the Paleo-Arctic Circle would have been hundreds of kilometers, farther than even, say, modern-day caribou do on the North Slope, and they're the longest, they migrate farther than any other land mammal today. And so that makes it difficult. We also have some other really cool evidence now suggesting that it seems very unlikely that these animals could have migrated that far as well. So I think the best evidence right now that we have says, no, they stayed put over the winter in northern Alaska and endured 4 or 5 months of darkness. And how they did that, I don't know, but I hope they had nightlights. Yeah?
What are the differences that make the duckbill dinosaur different from the ones in Alberta?
Oh yeah, so what are the things that make this animal different from others? It has to do primarily with the skull. If you take everything from the skull back, you cut their heads off and throw the rest of the animal away. The rest of the skeleton does not, unfortunately, tell you much. But the skull is different primarily in this bone right here, the premaxilla, and also in the postorbital, which is the bone right there, and also in some proportional measurements that we look at as well. And it was a difficult thing for us to do that in some cases with this dinosaur because most of our information comes from juveniles. And juveniles don't always show the adult states, but we do have enough adult material to sort of confirm these features. And so it's just a lot of gory anatomy about like little ridges and stuff on the premaxilla. But
Is that real or is that reconstructed?
this is a replica. So what we did with this skull, in the Liscombe bone bed, we find, as I mentioned, the bones are all disarticulated. All the bones have fallen apart, but they're three-dimensional when we dig them up. So we can dig out like the right postorbital as an isolated three-dimensional beautiful bone. Then next to it over farther, we'll find the left dentary of another individual and so forth. And we dig up all these individual bones, and because they're three-dimensional, we make copies of them in plastic, and then we can basically reassemble them, if they're all the same sized animal, into one composite skull. So this actually is built of individual bones from as many different individuals as there are bones. Yeah, and that's a lot of work to do that. Yeah?
When you were talking about that duck-billed dinosaur chewing, you actually said it would be unusual for a reptile to chew. So why'd you say reptile instead of dinosaur?
Well, reptiles are dinosaurs, and the term reptile has become a confusing term. And the reason for that is because dinosaurs, at least the meat-eating dinosaurs, one group of meat-eating dinosaurs is ancestral to birds. And so, technically speaking, birds are reptiles for that reason. So most of us don't think like that, right? If I say reptiles, and you're thinking, okay, I think snakes and lizards and turtles, but you're not thinking birds. You're omitting a member of a group that is descended from reptiles. So we don't like to do that. We like to use terms that represent groups of animals that are all related through ancestry. So dinosaurs are definitely reptiles, and if we use the word reptile now, it's understood that it includes birds in that definition. And that does represent a true group of animals. So dinosaurs are reptiles for sure, and birds as their ancestors are too. Yeah. Yeah.
Which brings up my question, which is that it seems like I've read so much that indicates that we think that dinosaurs were feathered.
Yeah.
And yet, it seems like almost every single artist's representation of dinosaurs you see has no feathers. And I'm curious.
Yeah, so what's going on with feathers and dinosaurs in short? Yeah, and that's, so it is true that the artists right now are all freaking out because the paleontologists are telling them to start putting feathers on the meat-eating dinosaurs. And that's a little crazy, thing to kind of wrap your head around. But indeed, as far as we know, most, but probably not all, but most of the meat-eating dinosaurs had feathers of some sort or another. So far as we know, the plant-eating dinosaurs, including duck-billed dinosaurs and Pachyrhinosaurus and those big long sauropods with the long necks like Brontosaurus, did not have feathers. So it's still okay to paint those with good old scaly skin and crazy colors, but the feathered dinosaurs are definitely almost most of the meat-eating dinosaurs. And so yes, they have to put feathers on there. In fact, the fossil feathers that we found primarily come from China and a few other places as well. And those feathered fossils are amazing. And they show us that some of the dinosaurs, in fact, very close relatives of things like Velociraptor, basically were feathered with the same kinds of feathers as a modern bird. They had complex asymmetrically veined flight feathers. They had contour feathers on their body. They probably had showy, symmetrically veined tail feathers. Crazy stuff. You would have had a hard time 70 million years ago going, is that a bird or a dinosaur? You wouldn't have a word for it. you'd probably call it a bird until it bit you. Yeah. Oh boy, how about over here? Sure.
You're talking about getting the actual age of the dinosaurs earlier with crossover and bone and stuff. Can you do that with cementum and aging on teeth, the same way you would mammals?
You can do some things with teeth. The problem with teeth are limited because, unlike mammals, they replace their teeth constantly through life. What we can understand from that study, though, is replacement rates of teeth, and actually how long an individual tooth was in the mouth of an animal, because they laid down daily layers of dentine as the tooth grew. So that when a tooth grows, the enamel cap grows quickly, and then the enamel portion grows at a slower rate from inside through the pulp cavity, and it adds a tiny thin layer every day. And that's called a line of von Ebner. And you can cut open the tooth in the right way and count those and tell how long it took for that tooth to grow and get an estimate of growth of replacement rates. But it won't tell you how old the animal is. It's not like, unfortunately, like aging that can be done for some mammals. It'd be nice if it were, but you know, that's a big difference there. Good question, though. Yeah. Yeah, in the back.
Is there any way to determine whether some species at least may have hibernated through the dark period?
Oh, good question. Did some dinosaurs hibernate? Right now, the evidence globally is we don't have any clear evidence for hibernating dinosaurs. But we do have evidence for at least one group of dinosaurs that they're small plant eaters. They're called thescelosaurs that were digging burrows. We found a few dinosaurs in burrows. And there's one in Montana called Eryctodromius, which means literally the digging runner. And it's a small, as an adult size, it was only about that big. And it's as I mentioned, it's this group called thescelosaurs. We have a very close relative, two of them actually, two different species in northern Alaska that are small-bodied. At least one of them is very small-bodied and could very well have dug holes. And if it dug holes, it could very possibly have hibernated. But to figure that out, then you need to look at the bone histology again. You need to slice open bones. And animals that hibernate sometimes leave behind very distinct lines of growth that might be indicative of hibernation. But we haven't demonstrated that yet. We don't have a lot of bones of these things yet. But that's an intriguing thought, and it's one that we want to follow up on.
Because you could see a fasting period, like tree rings on them.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking that in the dark, most plants wouldn't have done all that well. So the plant eaters, at least, would have had a hard time.
And that's a cool thing is like, so what did these dinosaurs do during the winter for food? One of the things that we've seen from other studies of dinosaurs elsewhere in the world is that dinosaurs, broadly speaking, were roughly warm-blooded. But you know that there's no like purely cold-blooded, purely warm-blooded. There's a range of variation in there. Dinosaurs may have been able to sort of be more, not so necessarily warm-blooded, but a little bit less than warm-blooded, which means that they may have had an advantage, if that were the case, in having lower metabolic rates and surviving on less food over long, dark periods when they needed that energy. And that may have actually been an advantage for them in some respects. So they either would have had to have left, they would have had to hibernated, or they would have had to just figure out how to live and cope with poor conditions. And you know, I'm always amazed that moose survive through the winters in Alaska. Being big helps. Being large-bodied, it helps you, it's called mass endothermy. It allows you to maintain a lot more warmth in your body. So there's a lot of strategies, and probably there's more than one answer. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, on the same subject, with the leaves and the trees, when the deciduous in all fall, was when the dinosaurs then have been like moose and stick eating rather than leaf eating.
Yeah, good question. So the vegetation, so the plant eaters had to eat something, and just like moose deal with low quality forage in the winters here, all of these trees up on the north slope, even the conifers, dropped their needles. They were deciduous conifers as well as broadleaf deciduous trees. And we have evidence from coprolites, fossil poo, not from Alaska, but from other places that suggest that dinosaurs were probably eating things like bark and twigs at least part of the year, and that they were surviving off of that. So some of them could have survived off of that. I'll tell you what, I'll take one more question, and then I don't want to hold up anybody, sure, let's.
Do you know is there any information on the soft tissue, like are there hindgut fermenters, foregut fermenters, is there any, they eat that kind of stuff, they need help, right?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I want to say that I do remember seeing one paper that talked about that with respect to some things found in coprolites, but I honestly don't remember what their take-home message was. So, but in general, no, there's not a lot of soft tissue evidence for things like that, unfortunately. So at any rate, I will just say that I'm happy to entertain more questions. So feel free to come up, look at goodies, and ask more questions. And thanks again for coming.